work ensuring that to be done. Probably the biggest known thing that was done during the Roosevelt administration on unemployment was the Civilian Conservation Corps, also known as the CCC. This law called for the hiring of unemployed single men between the ages of 18 and 25 to plant trees, dig reservoirs, build bridges, and develop parks across the United States. A lot of the things that you see concerning trees in the Bighorn Mountains, or reservoirs that you're able to fish, or bridges you have around this area, or parks, are a result of the CCC. It put a lot of men to work. At one time, more than 500,000 young men were enrolled in the Civilian Conservation Corps. Nearly all were unmarried and poverty-stricken. And here's some examples of the work the CCC did. They built fire trails in the forest. You got fire trails in the forest up here? More than likely the CCC did that. They cleared swamps. They planted trees. They built small dams for flood control. They cleared land for public parks. They helped conserve America's natural resources. Anybody ever heard, maybe you have or not, of Fort Peck Reservoir in Montana? Oh, have anybody heard of that? It's huge. I mean, you can see it. You can see it on the map. Can you kind of see it on the map from there? It's a huge reservoir right here. The whole thing was built by the CCC in the 1930s. Very big recreation area in northeastern Montana. A lot of fishing goes on there, a lot of boating. This area right here, all was built by the CCC during that time. Big deal. Okay, another thing that occurred was the National Youth Administration, sometimes known as the NYA. And that organization was created in 1935, and it distributed federal money to needy students. They were paid regular wages for performing tasks in and around their school. Now, students, this didn't have to be college students, it could be high school students. And during that first year of 1935, the NYA gave jobs to more than 400,000 students. They could work around their schools. My brother-in-law, might sound kind of crazy, in 1972, 3, 4, 5, in that area, he was in high school. You know what he did? You know what he did when he worked for the school, part of this thing here? You know what he did? Drove bus. He was a bus driver. He drove a bus. He was a sophomore in high school and drove bus routes here. Now, would you ever see that today? No, but that's what they did. It was a lot different time. And that work that kids did around the school, including driving buses, was part of this youth administration in which you hired youths within your school so they could make some money so they wouldn't have to what? Quit school and go to work. Okay? So you can see that, Roosevelt's administration just did a ton of things to try to solve the unemployment crisis, and it was awesome. I mean, he did just wonderful things. Okay, now we're going to start to talk about Negroes and the New Deal. This is kind of interesting because this is the 1930s. We're not even really to civil rights yet. Civil rights really starts in the 1950s with Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery bus boycotts. So civil rights as we know it as a fight for freedom doesn't start until the 1950s. So what about Negroes who were slaves during the Civil War, who've had their freedom since? What's the story on them? And what have presidents done for or against them? Well, there were a lot of needy black Americans that also gained relief from President Roosevelt's programs. And the issue was that during the Great Depression, black wage earners and farmers were hit harder than white workers, okay? And this was a result of discrimination in both the workforce and in housing for black people. You got to remember, at this point in American history, Negroes were stimulated to fight with renewed determination for their legal and constitutional rights. And it was in 1930s when they said, wait a minute, I don't think we're getting treated correctly. It wasn't the 1950s. Martin Luther King jumping on the scene led to the civil rights movement, but it was in the 1930s where Negroes all of a sudden were stimulated to fight for their legal and constitutional rights. And in many northern cities, black leaders organized "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaigns. In other words, don't buy from the local grocery store if they would not hire you to work there because you are black. Don't buy from the local gas station if they're not going to allow blacks to work there. And really in 1935 is where you have your first organization of civil rights with the National Negro Congress, which was established in 1935. It was established to promote the interests of black Americans within the New Deal agencies, and we'll explain that. Well, were there any prominent Negroes appointed to any federal positions in any president's administration prior to this? Not at all. So Franklin Roosevelt became the first president to appoint prominent Negroes to federal positions in his administration. And he did this for two reasons. One, he got tremendous pressure from the Negroes' search for equality. They were always knocking on his door. Hey, when are you going to make things equal for us? What's the story? The second reason he decided to do it is he was getting great pressure from his wife Eleanor, who believed that Negroes should have equal rights in the United States. And because of the pressure he was receiving from Negroes' search for equality and the push he was getting from his wife Eleanor, he established an informal group of advisors that were often called the Black Cabinet. Who else had some unofficial advisors back in the day we talked about? Andrew Jackson. What did we call him? Kitchen cabinet, because they snuck in the back of the kitchen and he met with them, but he didn't tell anybody. Well, this is going to be kind of the same thing. President Roosevelt's going to establish an informal group of advisors known as the Black Cabinet, and they're going to advise him on rights for Negroes, kind of under the table. Now, one of the most influential members of President Roosevelt's Black Cabinet was Mary McLeod Bethune. Now, I'll tell you a little, I've listed some things about her. Maybe you've heard about her. Mary McLeod Bethune. She was an extraordinary educator, civil rights leader, and government official. She founded the National Council of Negro Women. She founded Bethune-Cookman College in 1943. She was a political activist. She was the first African-American woman to be involved in the White House. She served 4 different presidents as an advisor. She served as race leader at large for the Franklin Roosevelt administration. She served as Director of Negro Affairs for the National Youth Administration. In other words, she made sure that African-American youths got jobs within the National Youth Administration, being able to work around their schools, either in high school or college. In 1974, the Bethune Memorial Statue was erected on parkland in Washington, D.C. We will show you that next year. So she was very, very influential. But the point of that whole subtopic is Franklin Roosevelt became the first president to realize we better do a little bit more for Negro rights in this country. He even appointed some prominent Negroes to his administration and had the Black Cabinet, a group of advisors who advised him on Negro affairs. Okay, New Deal measures to help farmers in America. They were in trouble, big time. And matter of fact, when Franklin Roosevelt became president, 40% of American farms were mortgaged. Okay? Farmers all over the country are faced with back taxes, interest payments, principal on their loans, and they were unable to pay those debts, so they watched their farms taken over by banks and private mortgage holders looking to do what? They're speculators to make a profit. Okay? Now, many farmers at this time when Roosevelt took over the presidency were homeless, jobless, had lost their farms. And to help relieve the situation, this is a brilliant move, the federal government made these farmers loans at very little interest rates. So with this borrowed federal money, this is what they could do. And if you're a farmer, you'll really get this. They could use the money they borrowed for the purchase of seed, fertilizer, and equipment necessary to continue their farm if they still owned their farm. Because some, 40%, 60% still had them. But they were struggling purchasing seed, fertilizer, and equipment necessary to continue. They could use the money for that. They also could use the money to refinance the loans that they could not repay at the time of foreclosure. So what's Roosevelt saying to these bankers and private speculators? We're going to get these people back and you're going to cooperate. Here's an example. A farmer owed $5,000 on his farm, which he had to repay over a period of 20 years at 5% interest. He could not make that obligation, therefore his farm went back to the bank or the mortgage company, right? Well, with this law, the farmer would borrow that $5,000 from the federal government. He'd pay off his original loan. He'd get his farm back. He would pay the mortgage lender or the bank. Then he would pay the federal government at 2.25% interest over 50 years. Could he afford that? That was just brilliant. And what Roosevelt did is he took these banks and these mortgage companies to task and said, wait a minute, you're holding the papers on these people. Before I let you sell them to speculators, we're going to make a rule where these guys can borrow whatever they owe and they'll just give you that money. And they can pay us back over a longer period of time at a lower interest. Is that genius or what, to get the farmers back where they needed to be? Now, this program for farmers was administered by the Farm Credit Administration, which was actually established in 1933. But how great of a job did Roosevelt do to take care of the farmers? That was perfect, man. That was great. And they appreciated it. Now, we do know that there were banks that were in trouble too, right? Because of the Depression. And so these are New Deal measures to aid the banking crisis in America. When President Roosevelt took office, the banking crisis in the United States was near total collapse. And I remember my mother on this one. People were so afraid of banks. They took their money out and they hid it in mattresses, floorboards, buried it in their yards. I'm not kidding you, I know they did this. My mother, when I was growing up, and she was born in 1917, so you think about how old she was during the Depression. She got burned, and her family got burned. I'll never forget this. My mother, you ever seen bread that, I'm trying to think of the type of bread, what do you give for Christmas? People give them out all the time. Oh, it's a fruit cake. Thank you. My mother had a fruit cake, and she took the fruit cake out of the tin foil and stuck money in there and folded it back up so it looked like the fruit cake and stuck it in the deep freeze. My mother did that when I was a little kid because she wasn't putting that $2,000, which was probably worth $15,000 now, in a bank. She learned not to try. It took her a long time. I remember they went, my mom always had cash hid in the freezer. And then they started using banks. But there were people that would not put a dime in there. They took all their money out in cash. They would bury it in their yards. They would put it in the floorboards of their houses, put it in their mattresses, because they didn't trust banks. Now you hear stories about maybe a year or two ago, some guy was digging in his backyard and found a whole bucket of those gold dollars that were worth millions of dollars. And they were hid by somebody after the Civil War. And they found those gold dollars, and because this is really weird, but because they belonged to the government, they made them give them back to the government. Guy should not have said a thing, kept them. But anyway, every once in a while, you'll see where people buy a house and maybe tear it up, tear a wall out. I've heard of stories where you found several $1,000s in cash where somebody probably put that and died or forgot about it or whatever, because that's what happened in the 1930s. Now, what Roosevelt did to take care of this bank issue is he declared a bank holiday across the United States. And this action basically closed all of the banks across the country for an indefinite period of time. Now, what does that keep people from doing? Taking out their money, because he knew if everybody withdrew their money, he wouldn't find a solution to it. These banks would go. So he has a bank holiday, nobody gets in or out of the banks, which I'm sure angered some people, until he could get it figured out. Well, finally, Roosevelt urges Congress to pass a new law to help the banking crisis in the United States, and it was called the Emergency Banking Relief Act, and it established that banks could reopen for business only if they could prove they had sufficient funds in the bank to cover their depositors. Okay? So if everybody in here had money in the bank and the depositors said, hey, we got 500,000 in that bank, if I had 350,000, I would not be able to reopen this bank until I was able to prove to the federal government that I had 500,000 in there to cover your deposits. It wasn't about making a profit at that point, it was about covering everybody's money. Because what do banks do with your money? You know, do banks just hold it, they don't make any money?
No,
How does Gil
rent it
McHenry
out.
make a salary?
Rent it out.
Well, they basically rent out your money. They borrow it to people with interest, and they keep the interest. That's how it works, okay? Well, by virtue of this law, the Emergency Banking Relief Act, only sound banks opened, while what happened to unsafe banks?
They close.
They just closed her down. So the law forced those banks that want to stay in business to make every effort possible to get financially sound or go out of business. Okay, we're moving on. Look how good we're doing. You're worried about Monday? We might be done today. Okay, the election of 1936. In June of 1936, the Democrats renominated Roosevelt for the presidency, a no-brainer. He had done all kinds of great things for the country. The Republicans, I think in the back of their mind, had to think we got no shot here. But they did nominate Kansas Governor Alfred Landon, and they put out an incredible effort. They spent over $9 million campaigning for Landon in this election compared to the $4 million spent by the Democratic Party. More than twice as much, hoping they could, get a shot at winning this particular election. They spent $9 million to get beat 523 electoral votes to 8.
Oh my God.
I mean, think about that. That was just incredible. They spent $9 million to get beat 523 to 8. If they don't spend a dime, Paris, they probably still get the 8. Who knows? But that's unbelievable when you think about it. This was the worst defeat in American history since James Monroe ran in 1820 when nobody ran against him. Worst defeat in American history in which you had two parties running against each other. Worst defeat since Monroe ran without opposition in 1820. Now, not long after this election, President Roosevelt began to face a series of troubles, including the following. The Supreme Court would rule that 7 of his New Deal laws that he had already passed were deemed unconstitutional, and the formation of labor unions across the country would concern him. He really struggled with these two issues. His popularity and his influence began to weaken a little bit, and despite that, he decided to run for a 3rd term. However, prior to the election of 1940, Germany invaded Poland, and it set the stage for a possible conflict in Europe with Germany, which eventually is going to be World War II. So keep that in mind, that World War II began before the election of 1940, and that's what we'll finish up with today. Okay, election of 1940. Again, Roosevelt runs for re-election. He has no trouble getting the nomination from the Democratic Party in Chicago. Roosevelt's Secretary of Agriculture, Henry A. Wallace, is going to replace John Nance Garner as his running mate. So Garner served with Roosevelt how many terms? 2. Okay? But Henry A. Wallace, who's the Secretary of Agriculture, is now going to run in the election of 1940 with Roosevelt. Campaign promises the Democratic Party made during the campaign. Roosevelt, he promised to keep the United States out of war. And he was not going to send American armies abroad unless our nation was attacked. Did he live up to those? Sure did, because when did we enter World War II? Pearl Harbor, okay? Now, the Republicans chose a New York lawyer by the name of Wendell L. Willkie as their presidential candidate. He was a very, very powerful and influential Wall Street lawyer, and he would provide the most competition that Roosevelt would face in any of the 4 elections that he won. The Republican Party promised to keep America out of war unless attacked, and they also promised to push for a constitutional amendment that would limit a president's length of service to 2 maximum terms. And that is going to happen, but not till later. But it's kind of interesting that it came up in 1940. They wanted to push for a constitutional amendment that would limit a president's length of service to 2 terms. This election, to this point, had the highest voter turnout in American history. But the people showed their confidence in President Roosevelt. They would elect him to a 3rd term. He would win 55% of the popular vote, which was down a little bit from the 60% he earned in 1936. 60% popular vote win is unbelievably big. But look at the Electoral College, and this was the closest he ever got, 449 to 82. I mean, this guy was popular. Unfortunately, in his term, he's going to have to face the challenge of keeping the United States out of war, which he is not going to be able to do. Pearl Harbor is going to be attacked on December 7th, 1941. We are going to enter World War II. He is going to take us through World War II. Before it ends, he is going to be elected to a 4th term and die. And Harry Truman will be the guy that ends and has the fate of the United States in World War II. And that, folks, is where we're going to pick up next year, right? The start of World War II. So we'll have a review tomorrow, and then we'll get ready for our test. I'm almost changing my mind a little bit. I'm thinking about having this review tomorrow, relax a little bit Monday. Don't we have school Tuesday?
Yeah.
Right. Have the test Tuesday, and then show you have a nice, awesome video on test day. How about that?
I would appreciate that highly.
What?
I would appreciate
Okay, let's do that, shall we? Then during semester exam day, we'll sit in here and we'll kind of prep ourselves. I'm going to show you aerial America, Washington, D.C.